The morning air in the small neighborhood always carried the same quiet rhythm. People walked quickly to work, shopkeepers lifted their shutters, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery. It was an ordinary place where nothing very surprising ever seemed to happen. Most people there lived simple lives and followed the same routines every day. Among the many faces in that neighborhood was a quiet young girl who often moved unnoticed through the streets. She didn't stand out in any special way. Her clothes were simple, her steps were calm, and she rarely spoke loudly. But inside her mind lived something that no one around her could easily see. She loved music. Not the kind people talked about in classrooms with books and complicated notes written on white paper. She didn't know anything about that world. She didn't understand what words like scales, chords, or theory really meant. Those things belonged to schools and teachers and students who had proper lessons. What she loved was the sound itself. Whenever she heard music floating through the air, she would stop without thinking. It didn't matter if the sound came from a passing car, a small radio, or someone humming while working. Her attention would immediately move toward it. She listened the way someone might watch the ocean waves, quietly and completely. But there was one instrument that captured her heart more than anything else. The piano. She first noticed it one evening while walking home. A small cafe near the corner of the street had its door open, and inside there was an old piano sitting near the window. A man was playing it softly while a few people drank coffee and talked. The melody drifted out into the street like a gentle breeze. She stopped walking. For several minutes she simply stood there, listening. The notes felt different from anything she had heard before. Some were soft, like quiet footsteps. Others rose higher and brighter, filling the air with warmth. The music seemed to tell a story even though there were no words. From that day on, she began passing that cafe almost every evening. She never went inside at first. She simply stood outside the window listening. Sometimes the same man played the piano. Sometimes another person sat down and tried a different melody. Each time she watched carefully, studying the movement of their hands. Her eyes followed every finger. It looked almost magical to her. 10 fingers dancing across black and white keys, creating something beautiful out of simple touches. She didn't know how it worked, but she felt as if the piano was speaking a language that her heart somehow understood. Weeks passed like this. The workers at the cafe began noticing the quiet figure standing near the window. At first they thought she was waiting for someone, but she kept returning night after night, always standing in the same place, always listening. One evening, when the cafe was nearly empty, the man playing the piano noticed her reflection in the glass. After finishing the song, he looked toward the window and gave a small smile. She quickly looked down and stepped back, feeling shy. But the next evening she returned again. She didn't realize it, but the music had already started changing something inside her. At home, she sometimes tried to copy the melodies she heard. There was no piano in the house, of course. Instead, she used the edge of a wooden table. Her fingers tapped the surface gently as she imagined the keys beneath them. Tap, tap, tap. The sounds were only soft knocks against the wood, but in her mind they became real notes. She remembered the melodies from the cafe and tried to recreate them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But she kept trying. Her family didn't pay much attention to this strange habit. They simply thought she liked music the way many people did. After all, plenty of young people enjoy songs on the radio. There was nothing unusual about that. What they didn't realize was how carefully she listened. When music played somewhere nearby, she wasn't just hearing it for fun. She was memorizing it. She paid attention to the rise and fall of the melody, the timing between notes, the way a song could grow louder and then suddenly softer. It was like solving a puzzle using only sound. Months later, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, the cafe was unusually quiet. The usual piano player had stepped away for a moment, leaving the instrument alone. Only a few customers remained inside. The door was open again. She stood outside like always, watching the empty piano. Her heart began beating a little faster. For the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to actually touch the keys. The thought made her nervous. She had never played a real piano before. She didn't know what she was doing. People inside might laugh if she tried something strange. Still, the quiet room and the empty chair seemed to invite her. She slowly stepped closer to the door. Then another step. The wooden floor inside the cafe creaked softly under her shoes as she entered. No one paid much attention. The customers were busy with their conversations. She moved toward the piano. Up close, it looked even more beautiful than it did through the window. The black surface reflected the light from above, and the keys stretched across the instrument like a long row of small doors waiting to be opened. She hesitated. Her fingers hovered in the air. For a moment she almost turned back. But curiosity pushed her forward. Very gently, she pressed one key. A single clear note filled the room. Her eyes widened slightly. The sound was real. Not imagined. Not tapped against wood. It vibrated through the air with a richness she had never experienced before. She pressed another key. Then another. Soon a simple pattern began forming beneath her fingers. It wasn't perfect. Some notes sounded slightly out of place. But she remembered the melody she had heard many times outside the cafe. Slowly, carefully, she tried to follow it. The notes stumbled at first like a child learning to walk. But little by little the melody began to take shape. One of the customers looked up from their coffee. Then another. They noticed the quiet girl sitting at the piano. The music was simple, but it carried something genuine. There was a softness in the way she touched the keys, as if she were afraid of disturbing the melody. When she finished, she quickly stood up, embarrassed by the sudden attention. A few people clapped politely. It wasn't a loud applause, just a small moment of encouragement. But for her, it felt enormous. Her face warmed with surprise. She hurried out of the cafe and walked quickly down the street. But that short moment stayed with her the entire evening. For the first time, she had touched a real piano. For the first time, she realized something important. The sounds she loved so much were not impossible to reach. They were waiting for her. She only needed the courage to keep trying. What she didn't know yet was that this simple moment would slowly lead her toward a much bigger challenge. A place where people believed music could only belong to those who studied thick books and complicated rules. A place where someone like her would not be taken seriously at all. And where one day people would laugh at the idea that she could ever play. But the piano had already begun teaching her something important. Music didn't start on paper. It started in the heart. The memory of touching the piano for the first time stayed with her long after that quiet afternoon in the cafe. Even while walking through the same streets and seeing the same buildings every day, something inside her had changed. The world sounded different now. Every small sound caught her attention. The soft rhythm of footsteps on pavement reminded her of a slow melody. The tapping of rain against a window sounded like scattered notes falling from a piano. Even the hum of a passing bus sometimes felt like the deep tone of the lower keys. Music was everywhere once she began noticing it. Whenever she passed the cafe again, she looked toward the piano through the window. Sometimes someone was already playing. Other times the instrument sat quietly in the corner like it was waiting. She didn't always go inside. That first time had taken all her courage. But every evening she still stopped for a few moments, listening carefully and watching the movement of the pianist's hands. Her eyes followed the fingers the way someone studies a map. Left hand, right hand, high notes, low notes. She tried to remember the patterns. At home, the wooden table once again became her imaginary piano. She sat in the same chair each night and tapped the surface with both hands, copying the melodies she remembered. Tap, tap, tap. Sometimes the rhythm was slow and thoughtful. Sometimes it was quick and playful. Her fingers moved more confidently now. The sounds were still only dull knocks against wood, but in her mind they turned into real music. Weeks passed like this. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood market, she heard two people talking near a small bookstore. They were discussing a music school located a few streets away. Students learn real piano there, one person said. Proper lessons. Real training. The words caught her attention immediately. A music school. She had never thought about a place like that before. Until now, Music had always been something she discovered alone, through listening and experimenting. But the idea of a place filled with pianos felt almost magical. For the rest of the day, that thought followed her everywhere. What if she could learn there? What if someone showed her how the instrument truly worked? Maybe there were secrets she had never imagined. That evening she walked slowly past the street where the school was located. The building was larger than most around it, with tall windows and a clean sign near the entrance. Through one of the windows she could see a piano. Another room had two more. She stood outside quietly for several minutes. Inside, a group of students sat around a teacher. Papers filled with musical notes rested on the tables in front of them. The teacher pointed at the pages while explaining something. The students nodded and wrote things down. She watched carefully, trying to understand. The paper looked confusing. Lines and symbols covered the page like a secret code. She had never seen music written that way before. For a moment she wondered if that meant she didn't truly understand music at all. But then she remembered the melody she had played in the cafe. The sound had been real. People had heard it. Music didn't disappear just because she couldn't read those strange symbols. Still, the thought of learning more made her curious. For 2 days she passed the building again without entering. Each time she stopped for a moment, watching students walk in and out with notebooks in their hands. They looked confident. They belonged there. She wasn't sure if she did. On the third day, something inside her finally pushed away the hesitation. She walked up the small steps and opened the door. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Soft music drifted from one of the classrooms, where someone practiced scales on a piano. The sound was very different from the melodies she heard at the cafe. It repeated the same notes again and again, rising higher and then dropping lower. A person sitting behind a desk looked up. "Can I help you?" the voice asked kindly. She paused for a moment before speaking. I wanted to ask about learning piano." The person smiled politely and pointed toward a nearby room. "You can speak with the instructor in there." Her heart beat faster as she walked toward the door. Inside the room, several students sat in chairs, while a teacher stood near a large board filled with musical symbols. Sheets of paper were spread across the tables. The teacher turned when she entered. Yes. She suddenly felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her. The attention made her nervous, but she forced herself to continue. "I wanted to learn piano," she said quietly. The teacher nodded. "That's good. Music is a wonderful thing to learn." Then the teacher asked a simple question. "How much theory do you already know?" She blinked. "Theory?" The teacher gestured toward the board filled with symbols. "Yes, scales, notation, chord structures, timing. Have you studied those before?" She slowly shook her head. A few students exchanged glances. One of them gave a small amused smile. The teacher continued asking questions. "Can you read sheet music?" She shook her head again. "Do you know the major scales?" Silence. "Minor scales." She looked down at the floor. "I only listen," she said softly. A quiet chuckle came from somewhere in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Another student whispered something to a friend, and both of them smiled. To them, it sounded strange that someone would walk into a music school without knowing even the basic language of music. The teacher didn't laugh, but the expression became more serious. "Music theory is important," the teacher explained. "Before playing properly, students usually spend time learning the foundations." The words were calm and professional, but they carried a clear message. "You are not ready." She stood there quietly, feeling smaller with each passing second. She hadn't expected the questions to be so difficult. In her mind, music had always been about listening and feeling. She never imagined there were so many rules attached to it. The teacher eventually said, "You may want to start with beginner theory classes first." More whispers came from the students. Someone quietly repeated the phrase, "skipping theory," with a light laugh. Her cheeks warmed. The room suddenly felt too bright, too crowded. She nodded politely, murmured a quiet thank you, and stepped back toward the door. No one stopped her as she left. The hallway felt much longer than before. When she stepped outside into the fresh air, She finally took a slow breath. For several minutes she simply stood there, staring down the street. Part of her felt embarrassed. Maybe the students were right. Maybe music really did belong only to people who understood all those complicated notes on paper. But another part of her remembered the sound of the piano in the cafe. The memory of that melody returned clearly. She had played it, even without theory, even without lessons. That memory refused to disappear. As she walked home, the laughter from the classroom echoed faintly in her thoughts. Not loudly, but just enough to remind her of how easily people dismiss something they don't understand. By the time she reached her house, the sky had begun to grow darker. She sat down at the wooden table again. For a moment she looked at her hands, remembering the strange symbols on the board at the school. Then she slowly placed her fingers on the table surface. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm began softly, almost uncertain. But after a few seconds the melody returned. The same gentle tune she had once heard drifting from the cafe window. This time she played it longer, more carefully, and with a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. The students at the school believed music began with theory, but she was beginning to believe something else. Sometimes music begins simply with listening, and sometimes the piano answers people who never learned the rules. The days after her visit to the music school felt a little heavier than usual. The streets were the same, the buildings looked the same, and the cafe piano still sat quietly by the window. Yet something inside her mind kept replaying the moment in that classroom. The questions, the symbols on the board, the quiet laughter from a few students. She tried not to think about it too much, but memories have a strange way of returning when you least expect them. Sometimes while walking through the market, she would suddenly hear the teacher's voice again asking about scales and notation. Things she had never learned. Things everyone else seemed to know. For a short time she wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe music truly belonged only to people who studied the rules first. Maybe those strange lines and symbols were the only real path to playing the piano. But every time that thought appeared, another memory followed right behind it. The first note she played in the cafe. The soft sound filling the room. The small applause from the people sitting nearby. That moment had been real. No theory had created it. No written notes had guided her hands. It had simply come from listening and trying. That memory gave her quiet strength. Instead of returning to the music school, she returned to something that had always been familiar. Listening. The cafe remained her favorite place. She still stopped outside the window whenever music floated through the open door. Sometimes she stayed for just a minute. Other times she stood there long enough to hear an entire song. The pianist who often played there had a gentle style. His fingers moved smoothly across the keys, never rushing, never forcing the sound. She watched every movement. Not the way a student watches a teacher, but the way someone watches waves rolling toward the shore. Patiently, carefully, she noticed that certain melodies repeated similar patterns. The left hand often played deeper notes that stayed steady, like footsteps walking forward. The right hand danced above them with lighter sounds that told the main story. She began remembering these patterns. At home, the wooden table once again became her practice space. But this time her practice was different. Before, she simply copied melodies she had heard. Now she began experimenting with her own sounds. Tap, tap, tap. Her left hand created slow rhythms while her right hand searched for higher notes that might fit above them. Sometimes the melody sounded beautiful in her imagination. Other times it felt messy and confusing. Still, she didn't stop. Even when a tune sounded wrong, she tried again. Night after night, her fingers slowly grew more confident. The movements became smoother, less hesitant. She started recognizing which imagined notes worked well together and which ones didn't. It was a strange kind of learning. There were no teachers correcting mistakes, no books explaining rules, no classroom telling her what was right or wrong. Only listening, only feeling. One afternoon something unexpected happened again. The cafe was quieter than usual. Only 2 customers sat near the back, speaking softly over their coffee. The familiar piano stood near the window, its surface reflecting the warm afternoon light. The usual pianist was not there. The chair was empty. She stood outside the window like always, watching the instrument. Her heart began beating faster. She remembered the first time she had walked inside. The nervous feeling in her chest. The way the single note had surprised her. For a moment she wondered if she should try again. But doubt quickly followed the thought. What if someone remembered her from before? What if they thought she was pretending to be something she wasn't? She looked through the window again. The piano waited quietly. Finally, curiosity won the small battle happening in her mind. She pushed the cafe door open. The same soft creak of the wooden floor greeted her as she stepped inside. No one paid much attention. The customers were busy talking. Slowly she walked toward the piano. The keys looked just as beautiful as she remembered. This time she didn't hesitate as long. She sat down and placed her hands above the keys. For a moment she simply listened to the quiet room. Then she began. The first notes were careful and gentle. She remembered a melody she had practiced on the table many times. Her fingers tried to recreate the pattern she had imagined. The sound came out a little uneven at first. Real keys felt different from wood. But after a few seconds the melody began to settle. Her left hand repeated a steady rhythm, while the right hand followed a simple tune that rose and fell softly. The cafe grew quiet. One of the customers stopped speaking and looked toward the piano. The other turned their head slowly. She didn't notice. Her attention stayed on the keys. Something about the real instrument helped the music grow stronger. The deep notes vibrated through the wooden body of the piano, giving warmth to the melody. She played longer this time. Long enough for the tune to develop into something more than a short pattern. When she finally stopped, the room remained silent for a brief moment. Then one of the customers clapped softly. The other joined. The applause was small, but genuine. She felt the same warm surprise she had felt during her first visit. A worker behind the cafe counter smiled. "That sounded nice," the worker said. She stood up quickly, feeling shy again. "Thank you," she replied quietly. As she walked toward the door, something interesting happened. The worker spoke again. "You play by ear, don't you?" She paused. "Yes." The worker nodded thoughtfully. "My brother plays like that too. Never studied theory. Just listens and plays." The words stayed with her long after she left the cafe. Someone else understood. Someone else believed music didn't always need to begin with books and symbols. From that day forward, she visited the cafe more often. Not every day, but whenever the piano happened to be empty and the room was quiet enough. Each visit gave her a little more confidence. She tried new melodies, new rhythms. Sometimes she played songs she had heard before. Other times she created completely new tunes without even realizing it. The music slowly grew richer. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. Meanwhile, the music school continued its normal routine just a few streets away. Students walked in and out with their notebooks and sheets of music. Lessons continued inside the classrooms. She passed the building sometimes, but she didn't go back. Not yet. Instead, she followed the path that felt natural to her. Listening, feeling, playing. She didn't realize it, but every quiet practice session was building something stronger than she imagined. Her fingers were learning how to move without hesitation. Her ears were learning how to recognize harmony. Her heart was learning how to turn emotion into sound. And somewhere in the future, a moment was waiting. A moment when the same people who once questioned her understanding of music would hear something they did not expect. A moment when the piano itself would speak louder than any lesson. But for now, she simply continued practicing in the quiet corners of the world. One note at a time. Time moved quietly through the neighborhood, the same way music moves slowly through a calm melody. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. Nothing around her looked very different, but inside her something continued to grow stronger. Her visits to the cafe became a small but important part of her routine. Sometimes she only stopped outside the window to listen. Other days, if the piano happened to be free and the room was quiet, she stepped inside and played for a few minutes. No one had officially given her permission to practice there, but the workers had begun recognizing her. They noticed that she always treated the instrument with care. She never played loudly or tried to show off. She simply sat down, played gently, and left with a quiet smile. Little by little, the music inside her head became clearer. Before, she had copied melodies she heard from others. Now she started creating her own. Sometimes the tune began with just a few simple notes. Other times it started with a soft rhythm in her left hand. Then the right hand would slowly search for a melody that felt right. She didn't know the names of the chords she was playing. She didn't know what scale the notes belonged to. But she knew when something sounded beautiful, and when something didn't. Each mistake taught her something new. When a note sounded wrong, her fingers adjusted the next time. When a rhythm felt too heavy, she softened it. The learning was slow but natural. Meanwhile, life outside the cafe continued like normal. People hurried through the streets, buses passed by, and children played in the evenings near the small park. But the music school down the road remained a place she rarely thought about visiting again. The memory of that classroom still felt uncomfortable. The laughter had not been cruel or loud, but it had left a mark in her mind. Every time she imagined walking back inside that building, she remembered the feeling of standing there without answers. Still, fate has a strange way of bringing people back to places they try to avoid. One afternoon, while walking home from the market, she noticed something unusual happening near the music school. Several people stood outside the building, talking and moving equipment through the front door. A small banner hung above the entrance. It looked like some kind of event was taking place. Curiosity slowed her steps. She moved a little closer to read the banner more clearly. It announced a small community music gathering that would take place that evening. Students from the school would perform for visitors and local residents. Through the open doors, she could hear the sound of a piano being tested inside the main hall. The sound instantly caught her attention. It was brighter and stronger than the piano in the cafe. The notes echoed gently through the hallway, filling the space with rich vibrations. For a moment, she simply stood there listening. The sound instantly caught her attention. It was brighter and stronger than the piano in the cafe. The notes echoed gently through the hallway, filling the space with rich vibrations. For a moment, she simply stood there listening. Then she quietly stepped inside. The entrance hall was busier than she expected. Chairs were being arranged in rows. A few people carried music stands across the room. Others talked while adjusting lights near a small stage. At the center of the stage stood a beautiful grand piano. Its surface shined under the lights, and the lid was raised high to let the sound travel through the room. She had never seen a piano quite like it before. Without thinking, she moved closer to the back of the hall and sat in an empty chair. Students walked across the stage one by one, practicing small sections of their pieces. Some played carefully while reading sheet music placed in front of them. Others repeated the same section again and again until it sounded perfect. The audience had not arrived yet, so the room was filled mostly with quiet preparation. She listened carefully to every sound. Some performances were impressive. The students played quickly, their fingers moving across the keys with clear training and control. But something else caught her attention. Even though the music was technically correct, some of it felt distant. Almost like the players were following instructions rather than telling a story. She couldn't explain that feeling in words. She only knew what her ears told her. As she sat there quietly, a few students began noticing her presence. Some of them recognized her from the day she had visited the classroom months earlier. One of them whispered something to another student. Soon 2 or 3 pairs of eyes glanced toward her chair. A small smile appeared on someone's face. The memory had clearly returned to them as well. The girl who walked into the music class without knowing theory. The girl who couldn't answer simple questions about scales and notation. The whispers weren't loud, but she could sense them. It made her shift slightly in her seat. She considered leaving. But before she could stand up, something unexpected happened. One of the organizers walked onto the stage and announced that there would be a short break before the evening performances began. During that time, anyone present could briefly try the piano if they wished. It was meant as a light-hearted moment before the official program started. A few students laughed and clapped at the idea. Some of them had already practiced their pieces and felt relaxed enough to experiment. The organizer stepped away from the stage, leaving the grand piano waiting under the lights. For a moment no one moved. Then one student walked up and played a few playful notes. Others followed, each trying small melodies while friends watched and joked nearby. The atmosphere felt casual and friendly. But when her eyes met the piano again, something stirred inside her. The instrument seemed to call to her in the same quiet way the cafe piano once had. Yet this place was different. This was the music school. The same place where she had once stood silently while others questioned her understanding of music. The same place where people believed theory came before everything else. She remained seated, unsure what to do. Across the room, one of the students who recognized her leaned toward a friend and whispered something again. Both of them glanced at her and smiled, not cruelly, but clearly remembering the past moment. One of them spoke just loud enough for nearby people to hear. Maybe she wants to skip theory again and try the piano. A few soft laughs followed. The words floated through the room like a small cloud of doubt. She felt the familiar warmth rise to her cheeks. For a second she looked down at the floor, considering the easiest choice. Leave quietly. Walk back into the street. Forget this place again. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the months of practice at the cafe. Maybe it was the quiet determination that had grown every night at the wooden table. Or maybe it was simply the sound of the piano waiting on the stage. Slowly, she stood up. The movement caught a few people by surprise. She walked toward the stage with calm steps, even though her heart beat faster with each one. The whispers returned as she approached the piano. Some students watched with curious expressions. Others exchanged amused glances. To them, the situation looked familiar. The girl who didn't know theory was about to sit at a piano again. She reached the bench and paused for a moment. Then she sat down. The grand piano keys stretched before her, brighter and smoother than any she had touched before. The room grew quieter. No one expected much. Most people assumed she would play a few random notes and step away. But as her fingers gently rested on the keys, she took a slow breath. In that moment she didn't think about the classroom. She didn't think about theory. She only remembered the hundreds of melodies she had listened to, and the countless hours she had practiced in silence. Her fingers began to move, and the piano answered. For a brief moment after she sat down at the grand piano, the room remained filled with quiet whispers. A few students leaned toward each other, clearly expecting something awkward or amusing to happen. Some crossed their arms, waiting to see how long she would stay at the piano before giving up. The large instrument looked almost too grand for someone who had never studied in that school. The polished surface reflected the soft lights above the stage, and the raised lid allowed every sound to travel across the hall. She placed both hands gently above the keys. Her fingers didn't move right away. Instead, she took a slow breath. The room slowly settled into silence. The whispers faded as people waited. Some of them still smiled quietly, remembering the day she had stood in the classroom unable to answer questions about theory. To them, this moment looked like a repeat of that memory. But something inside her had changed since then. During the past months, she had spent many evenings standing outside the cafe window, listening to melodies drift into the street. She had spent many nights tapping rhythms against a wooden table, trying to remember every note she had heard. She had also played on the cafe piano several times, slowly learning how the keys responded to her touch. All of those quiet moments had built something inside her that no one in this room could see. Finally, her fingers pressed the first key. A soft, clear note filled the hall. The sound echoed slightly because of the size of the room, giving the single note a gentle power. Then another note followed, and another. At first the melody moved slowly, almost carefully, like someone walking through a new place and studying every step. Her left hand settled into a steady rhythm, playing deeper notes that created a calm foundation. The sound was warm and smooth, spreading across the room like a slow heartbeat. Her right hand followed with a gentle melody above it. The tune was simple, but it carried emotion. The notes rose softly, then fell again, almost like a quiet conversation. A few students exchanged glances. This was not what they expected. The whispers had stopped completely now. The melody continued growing. Her fingers moved with more confidence, traveling across the keys in a natural flow. She didn't look at any sheet music because there wasn't any in front of her. Everything came from memory and feeling. The rhythm strengthened slightly as the melody began to change. It turned brighter, more expressive, like sunlight slowly breaking through clouds. One of the teachers standing near the side of the hall straightened slightly, paying closer attention. The sound of the piano filled the entire space now. Every note carried clearly to the back of the room. She wasn't playing quickly or trying to impress anyone with speed. Instead, she allowed the melody to breathe. Some notes lingered longer than others, giving the music a human quality. Felt less like a performance and more like a story being told. The story moved through different moods. At one moment, the music sounded thoughtful and calm. The next moment it grew hopeful, almost joyful, before returning to a softer feeling again. People in the audience began leaning forward slightly in their chairs. They could sense something honest in the way she played. Even though the melody was unfamiliar, it felt meaningful. Halfway through the piece, the rhythm shifted again. Her left hand began playing a deeper pattern that rolled gently like distant thunder, while the right hand created a brighter line of notes above it. The music felt larger now, more confident. The same students who had whispered earlier now sat quietly, their expressions slowly changing from amusement to curiosity. They had expected random notes or a short, awkward moment. Instead, they were hearing a complete musical idea unfolding in front of them. The teacher who had once asked her about theory crossed their arms thoughtfully, listening with careful attention. There was something unusual about this performance. Technically, it might not follow the perfect structure taught in classrooms, but the emotion inside the music felt genuine. And emotion is something no theory book can create on its own. The melody climbed higher across the keys, reaching brighter notes that sparkled gently in the air. Then it slowed again. Her fingers softened their touch, allowing the sound to fade slightly before rising once more. Felt almost like breathing. Inhale, exhale. The piano responded to every movement of her hands. By now the room was completely silent except for the music. Even people walking in the hallway outside the hall had paused near the door, curious about the unexpected melody drifting through the building. Her eyes remained focused on the keys, but her expression looked calm and natural. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't thinking about the students or the whispers from earlier. She was simply playing. The final section of the melody approached slowly. Her left hand returned to the steady rhythm that had started the piece. The right hand repeated a gentle pattern of notes, each one slightly softer than the last. The music began to settle, like a story reaching its quiet ending. The final notes floated lightly through the room. Then her fingers lifted from the keys. For a moment no one moved. The silence that followed felt deeper than before. It lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds something important changed inside the room. The students who had whispered earlier now looked at each other with different expressions. Not confusion, not amusement, something closer to respect. Finally, a soft clap broke the silence. One person in the back of the room had started applauding. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with warm applause. The sound echoed across the walls, louder than she expected. She looked slightly surprised, almost unsure how to react. The teacher near the stage nodded slowly while clapping as well. The applause continued for several seconds before slowly fading. When it ended, the room returned to quiet again, but this time the atmosphere felt completely different from before. The whispers were gone. No one mentioned theory. No one laughed. The girl who once stood silently in the classroom had just spoken through the piano instead. And the piano had answered louder than any explanation ever could. The applause in the hall slowly faded, but the feeling it created did not disappear so quickly. For several seconds after the clapping stopped, the room remained quiet. People were still processing what they had just heard. She sat at the piano bench without moving, her hands resting gently on her lap. The bright stage lights felt a little warm on her face, and she suddenly became aware that many eyes were still looking at her. Just a few minutes earlier, those same eyes had expected something completely different. Some had expected a mistake. Some had expected an awkward moment. Some had even expected a reason to laugh again. Instead, the piano had told a story no one in the room expected. Slowly, she stood up from the bench. The movement was calm and simple, the same way she had walked to the stage. She did not try to make the moment dramatic. She only gave a small, respectful nod toward the room before stepping away from the instrument. For a moment no one spoke. Then a few quiet conversations began among the students sitting in the chairs. Their voices were low, but the tone had changed. Earlier, the whispers had carried amusement. Now they carried curiosity. How did she learn that? Did you see any sheet music? I thought she didn't know theory. The teacher who had once asked her those questions stood near the side of the stage. The teacher watched her step down from the platform and walk toward the aisle. Instead of returning to organizing the event, the teacher walked over to her. She noticed the movement and stopped. For a second she felt the same nervous feeling she had experienced months earlier when standing in the classroom. But the teacher's expression was calm and thoughtful. "That was beautiful," the teacher said. The words were simple, but they carried sincerity. She looked slightly surprised and answered quietly, "Thank you." The teacher paused for a moment, as if choosing the right words. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated before answering. "I mostly listened," she said, "and practiced when I could." The teacher nodded slowly. "By ear?" "Yes." The teacher looked back toward the piano for a brief moment. "Not many people can do that," the teacher said. She didn't know what to say in response, so she simply smiled politely. Behind them, some of the students were still discussing the performance quietly. A few of them looked over occasionally, their expressions thoughtful rather than amused. The same students who had once whispered about skipping theory were now trying to understand what they had heard. The teacher continued speaking. "Music theory is important," the teacher said gently. "It helps people understand structure and communicate ideas." She listened carefully. Then the teacher added something else. "But music itself, that comes from somewhere deeper." The teacher gestured toward the piano on the stage. "What you played had feeling. That is something no book can teach on its own." The words surprised her again. Months earlier she had walked out of this same building believing she did not belong here. Now the conversation felt completely different. The teacher looked back at her. "If you ever decide you want formal lessons, the door is open." The offer was spoken without pressure. Just an honest invitation. She nodded respectfully. "Thank you." At that moment one of the event organizers stepped onto the stage again and announced that the official performances would begin soon. The audience members who had arrived early began returning to their seats. The teacher smiled once more and walked back toward the stage to prepare for the event. She quietly moved toward the back of the hall. For a moment she considered sitting down again to watch the rest of the performances, but something inside her felt ready to leave. Not because she was uncomfortable, but because the moment she needed had already happened. She stepped outside the building and into the evening air. The sky had begun turning a soft shade of orange as the sun slowly moved toward the horizon. The street lights were just beginning to glow. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. But her steps felt lighter as she walked down the sidewalk. The memory of the performance replayed in her mind, not as a dramatic victory but as a quiet confirmation. The music she loved had been real all along. It had never needed permission to exist. As she walked through the familiar streets, the sounds of the city surrounded her again. A distant car passed by. Someone laughed while talking with a friend. A small radio played music from a nearby shop. Every sound blended into the natural rhythm of the evening. When she reached the cafe on the corner, she noticed the lights were on inside as usual. A few customers sat at the tables, and the old piano still rested near the window. She stopped for a moment and looked through the glass. The familiar pianist was playing again, his fingers moving gently across the keys. The melody drifted into the street. She listened the same way she had listened many months earlier. But this time the feeling was different. Before, she had stood there as someone discovering music for the first time. Now she stood there as someone who had answered it. The pianist inside finished the piece and glanced toward the window. When he noticed her standing there, he smiled and gave a small wave of recognition. She smiled back. For a brief moment she considered going inside to play again. But tonight she simply stayed outside, enjoying the sound. Because she understood something important now. Music was not a competition. It was not a test with right and wrong answers. And it was not limited to people who knew every rule. Music was a conversation. Some people learned the language through books and lessons. Others discovered it through listening, feeling, and trying again and again until the sound inside their heart finally found its way into the world. She continued walking down the street as the melody from the cafe slowly faded behind her. The night air felt cool and calm. Somewhere in the distance another piano note drifted faintly through an open window. She smiled softly when she heard it, because she knew that whenever someone listened closely enough, the piano always had something to say. And sometimes, when the moment was right, someone answered back.